in Kazakhstan, and good afternoon. And good afternoon to those who are in UK, right? So thank you for joining us today. And we're very happy to have Professor Gavin Helf to talk about the US foreign policy in Central Asia. Again, given this recent developments in the region or in the wider region, I think it's one of the topic that we have been looking forward to hear more about. So thank you very much, Professor Helf, for joining us. Just let me briefly introduce Professor Help. He is a senior expert on Central Asia for the U.S. Institute for Peace in Washington, D.C. He has extensively worked on Central Asia, on Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and other countries, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. Before joining USIP, he worked as a senior democracy and governance advisor in the US AID, right, in Asia Middle East Bureau. So again, he covers lots of topics related to the region. And again, thank you very much for coming. It's a pleasure having you. So just to remind you about the format of today's event, Dr. Hev will talk for about 25-30 minutes about the US foreign policy in Central Asia, and then we're going to have more Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please keep them until the Q&A session. And thank you again. Dr. Helf, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So first of all, I want to caveat this by saying that I don't represent the United States government. I stopped working for the United States government about 3 years ago. But what I'm going to offer is a view from inside sort of the Washington think tank community that looks at Central Asia and US policy. The ideas that I'm sharing are my thoughts, but I think that they represent a fairly consensus perspective from that community. So, what we're really looking at is the kind of a sea change in the context of Central Asia policy that we saw, basically twice before, maybe in 1992 and then in 2001 after 9/11. There's been a fundamental change in the geostrategic situation around Central Asia and the South Caucasus since August of 2021. And so as a good policy expert and as a good policy brief, I'm going to give you what we call the bluff, the bottom line up front. That's in case any of you are important government officials who need to leave after 5 minutes. You always have to get that in the first, in the first 5 minutes, the bluff. So here's my bottom line. Russia and the United States are strategically distracted. China has not quite decided what kind of a power it wants to be in the Central Asia region. And regional powers that once deferred to Russian dominance are poised to take advantage of conflicts between the countries in the region. So let me elaborate on that and walk you into that conclusion. So the first thing that really led to this new situation that we're in was Afghanistan. The US withdrawal from Afghanistan last year and the return of the Taliban has led to a fundamentally new situation for the region. For 20 years, the United States was responsible for Afghanistan's behavior and foreign policy in the region. For 20 years, the countries of Central Asia and the countries around Afghanistan to the south didn't have to really worry about what Afghanistan meant for regional politics, since the United States had largely taken responsibility for that. With the return of the Taliban, Afghanistan again becomes a player, or more importantly, a chessboard on which different regional powers and different countries will have to deal with it. And of course, the countries of Central Asia now have to re-engage with Afghanistan in a new way. The second, and maybe more important, big geostrategic shift has been what, I sort of wonder which term I should use for this, but what I usually call the deflation of Russian presence and Russian power in the region, or, to be a little more kind, the diversion of Russian interest, Russia's preoccupation with Ukraine. Now, this is all you all in Kazakhstan know that Russia's influence in the region has been eroding before the invasion of Ukraine, as a new generation comes to power in the region. There have been huge shifts in linguistic and cultural presence of Russia in the region over the last generation. So that slow generational change, the discovery in Kazakhstan of decolonization theory in academia, the increasing narratives about defining the 20th century and what happened in the 20th century in World War II, looking at the Soviet past, that all predated Ukraine. But Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine really was a breaking moment for Russian presence in the region. It, first of all, has very seriously busted the myth of Russian military superiority. If only a few years ago, governments in the region, Kyrgyzstan, for instance, and OXUS in 2010, would be asking the CSTO and Russian troops to come in and stabilize a situation, that implied this idea that, Russia could defend the border with Afghanistan and Tajikistan. It could reimpose order if it wished. It was able to act with a lot of military power. That's been heavily eroded by the performance of Russian military in Ukraine. It has been, added to by the withdrawal of much of the combat power of Russian military units in Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, also in Georgia from, Ossetia and Abkhazia. The withdrawal of a lot of those military units and their redeployment to Ukraine. That means that Russian power that doesn't look so good anymore is actually largely not there anymore to sort of do these things. And then, as you all know, I think one thing that is really important in the region, but probably often lost in American conversations, is the ideological shift that is represented by Putin's justification of the invasion of Ukraine. If up until that, I'm thinking very much of the rhetoric, but also the speech that Putin gave on the eve of the invasion of Ukraine, which justified the invasion of Ukraine not by simply saying, hey, we want to grab 5 oblasts of a neighboring country, but argued that the entire Bolshevik, Stalin, Lenin creation of territorial ethnic units in what was once a unitary Russian empire was illegitimate. And as you all know, Russian National Bolsheviks and former presidents will tell you that Russia is Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and northern Kazakhstan. So for the region, this turns Russia ideologically into a threat. All of that means that Russia's ability to act in the region and Russia's ability to be present has been seriously, I say, deflated over time. China, again, has very much sort of played the role and stated that its role was economic development through the Belt and Road, One Belt, One Road initiative, and largely relied on the security guarantees provided by the Russian security umbrella in Central Asia and the American NATO military presence in Afghanistan. Suddenly that's gone. Both of the United States and Russia are distracted and looking elsewhere. And China really has to figure out how it's going to behave. Up until not too long ago, China was exploitative in its engagement with Central Asia in terms of how it managed construction projects and investment through Chinese parastatals. There's a debt trap situation that Turkmenistan found itself stuck in. But increasingly, China has made an effort to increase its soft power capabilities in the region, to play a better role in the region. And it really finds itself on the horns of a security dilemma. We've seen over time that China has increasingly employed private security services, private security forces to defend assets, and increasingly has a military presence in Badakhshan that's designed to sort of buffer Xinjiang and the Uyghur issue from Afghanistan and what's going on there. And then finally, I think I see this as a very much China's a developing piece of the context. We were all here very much noted China's, when Xi Jinping made his first trip abroad after COVID, he came to Kazakhstan, he came to Astana, and he made a declaration that I think represents maybe China's first serious security commitment in the region that was very much aimed at Putin and very much aimed at Russia, when he said that China respects the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence of Kazakhstan. So I think from the American perspective, we're looking at China, which is maybe the country in the region that is potentially, a new hegemonic power if it decides to move in that direction, and trying to decide, in the United States, almost everything that China does is viewed negatively, or has the adjective maligned, malign influence, malign investment stuck in front of it. I think when we think about what China's investment mean, engagement in the region, we have to decide the extent to which, like the countries of Central Asia themselves, decide the extent to which American interests and Chinese interests in economic development, in security, and issues around Afghanistan overlap and don't necessarily conflict with each other. So, that's created a new geostrategic. So we've got, Russia distracted, the US distracted, China trying to figure out what kind of a role it wants to play in the region. And then we've got this really amazingly interesting new situation where regional powers, middle-level powers that have in the past deferred to Russian domination of the region are now taking on a more active role. They, I would say, appear to take advantage of conflicts between the countries in the region and disunity in the region to try to seek ways to extend their own otherwise pre-existing rivalries. So we've seen some really bizarre combinations in this game in both the Caucasus and Central Asia. And I only will, think of what this means, right? We've got in the Caucasus, Armenia being supported by a combination of Russia and Iran against an Azerbaijan, which is being supported by Turkey and Israel. So, we're starting to see this Turkey-Iran rivalry playing itself out in the Caucasus in proxy warfare and over Karabakh. And I think it's, I think my illustration of what that looks like in Central Asia, you can simply take the recent conflict between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, in which now we have Persian-speaking Iran supporting Persian-speaking Tajikistan with military drone support, whereas Kyrgyzstan is receiving military support in the form of combat drones from Turkic-speaking Turkey. So we're seeing these rivalries that pre-existed starting to play a role. For most of the time that I've been looking at Central Asia since the mid-1990s, Turkey and Iran have been fairly low influence in the region. Now we're starting to see a lot more of that game being played out on the chessboard of the Caspian region, Central Asia and South Caucasus. one thing, I think the last piece of the context that I'd like to mention is something that's been, I think, pleasantly surprising to me, is the degree to which the Central Asian states, and then to a lesser extent the South Caucasus states, have approached this new situation from a position of confidence, self-confidence, and engagement. The efforts of President Tokayev and Kazakhstan to push back on Russia represent a level of self-confidence, I think, which is growing. The Uzbek and President Mirziyoyev's engagement of the Taliban in Afghanistan is not, being played out from a position of weakness and fear. It's being played out from a position of self-confidence and strength. So that kind of sets the stage. We've got Russia distracted, the US distracted, China trying to figure itself out, regional powers that used to not really play in the region starting to engage and look for ways to play off against each other. And we have Central Asian states that are, at least in part, approaching this problem from a level of self-confidence and agency. So let's talk a little bit about how this looks in terms of US policy. I think we can say that US policy is at a low point in terms of its leverage in the region. Our economic leverage is very low. US, the order of magnitude of Russian economic leverage in the form of labor remittances in the region, which hover in the 10 to 12 to $13 billion a year range. Chinese economic investment in the sort of off and on in an $8 billion a year range in Central Asia, and then American foreign assistance, which at its very maximum after 9/11, had reached 700 million. So that's an order of magnitude, 700 million versus 13 billion. Our military, the US military and security engagement in the region has been largely tied to, it's been transactional in utilitarian, tied to Afghanistan and to the war on terror or counterterrorism. I would say our political and governance leverage, or the extent to which the United States and US political system and culture are seen as a model, is probably not as high as it was in the early to mid 90s, in terms of, I would even say, how the US was able to deal with COVID doesn't look all that much better than how authoritarian countries dealt with COVID. And the stability of democratic politics in the United States is questionable, compared to what it was in the 90s. So, we don't have a lot of tools in the toolbox. We don't have the kind of leverage that like China, Russia, used to have, or even mid-range, mid-level countries that are closer to the region might have. So, what have been in the past the main lines of effort in US policy? Again, I think it largely has to do with US interests that transcend the issues in Central Asia, or it has a lot to do with where Central Asia is located and what it's between. So in the 1990s, in the Clinton administration, it was all about how to assist the countries of the region in getting oil and gas out to the United States and to Europe. I remember at the time when I first came to Almaty to work for IREX, and the embassy was located there, the US ambassador at the time, Beth Jones, had a nice bumper sticker on her car that said, "Happiness is multiple pipelines." And that sort of, was a very defining piece of the policy. In the interim, the United States has found other sources of oil and gas. primarily by inventing ways to, pull oil and gas through fracking out of what used to be very unproductive sites in the United States. So our need, the direct U.S. need to find ways to get Central Asian energy resources out has diminished over time. Although it is now, becoming important for the situation with Europe. The second sort of big thing in our 1990s policy that's been a consistent thread is sovereignty and territorial integrity, which is a euphemism for countering Russia in the region and not allowing Russia to reestablish control. And that seemed to be more or less an assured deal when we all celebrated the 30th anniversary of independence and the 30th anniversary of relations. It seemed that was solved, although that now seems to be back on the table. And then finally, as sort of a default, there was always an emphasis on democracy and human rights. Now, truth in advertising, I spent 15 years as a democracy officer with USAID, trying to promote democracy and human rights in places, including in Central Asia. And I think the idea, of a quick and early adoption of American and Western models of politics, political competition, human rights, and civil society has largely failed in the region, although it continues to be something that we talk about. But what really was the first sea change in US policy in the region was 9/11, with the beginning of the global war on terror after the Al-Qaeda attack in New York and the invasion of Afghanistan. US policy in the region became very focused on access to Afghanistan, support for Afghanistan, the Northern Distribution Network, which provided an alternative way to get troops and materiel into Afghanistan. In fact, one Central Asian ambassador in Washington once joked with me that the U.S. strategy for Central Asia that the State Department published a few years ago could be summarized as Afghanistan, 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 democracy. And then later joked after the Taliban came to power in Kabul again last year, that now it's time, you can write a Central Asia policy that mentions one of the names of the countries of the region. So Afghanistan became the overarching reason that we were in Central Asia. The other was counterterrorism, and particularly the rise of the appearance of foreign fighters of Central Asian origin in ISIS and in other places led to sort of an emphasis on counterterrorism, which I think often led to in that period giving the countries of the region a pass on human rights issues when that was threatening to that larger issue of counterterrorism, and especially access to Afghanistan. So where are we now, given that context and given that history? With the limited bandwidth and the limited leverage that the US has, US policy, I think, is likely to become focused on a couple of things. First of all, there'll be, to the extent that the issue comes up, we'll be focused on trying to provide humanitarian assistance to Afghan refugees and, working from Central Asia to provide what in the context of Afghanistan is now being called humanitarian plus assistance. So again, there's a small residual sort of access to Afghanistan, inclusion of Afghanistan piece. We will think about contesting the influence of China, of Iran, and maybe Turkey, depending on how that works out. But that the issue of Uyghurs and Xinjiang that's also a thing. But I think the really two big lines of effort, and this is, from what I'm hearing in our workshops, roundtables, and conversations here, are two things. The first is, given the strategic distraction of Russia, given the damage of the impact of sanctions and the consequences of economic sanctions on Russia in Central Asia and also the Caucasus, how can the United States, how can we support Central Asian countries reconnecting to the global economy in ways that don't depend as much on Russia and in ways that don't leave Central Asia a resource colony of China? This can be, I think some of the big things that people talk about here, obviously, are, how to avoid getting caught in the sanctions bubble around Central Asia on financial, trade, and investment issues. Looking at alternative destinations for labor migrants and labor migration, so that not everyone from Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan have to go to Russia. There are other destinations that will at least diversify labor migrations and remittances. Looking at, especially now, given the situation with gas and oil supplies being cut off from Russia, how can the countries of Central Asia find ways to the Trans-Caspian Middle Road access or egress in ways that can support Europe? That obviously all becomes more interesting. So basically, the big rubric is, how can Central Asia reconnect to the global economy, given what's happened over the last year, in ways that allow it diversification or alternatives to everything going through Russia. The second thrust of U.S. policy, and we as the good friend who's far away, who's powerful but far away, and doesn't necessarily have the same kind of leverage as countries that are closer. How can we support regional solidarity? How can we support the countries of Central Asia becoming more of a grouping of 70 million with lots of economic and energy resources in ways that maybe mitigate some of the infiltration of other powers trying to find seams? And here, I will mention what you guys all probably already, have thought a lot about, which is the treaty that was signed in Cholpanata in Isyk-Kul during the meeting of the 5 Central Asian presidents. I've been arguing that when I look at that, I see that as a glass that is 3/5 full rather than 2/5 empty. So we are very interested in ways that help build the agency and solidarity of those countries. So let me go back to the bluff and give you the bottom line, and I'll add a little bit. Russia and the US are strategically distracted. China has not yet completely decided what kind of a power it wants to be in the region and is engageable. And regional powers that once deferred to Russian dominance are poised to take advantage of conflicts between the countries in the region. The US will likely focus what limited leverage it has on supporting efforts at regional solidarity and agency in helping the region maximize economic connections that offer alternatives to Russia and China. So I'd really love now to hear your thoughts on how this looks for you from your perspective. We have a lot of sessions that they're talking specifically about these things and how the United States can assist in the region in ways that maximizes the independence and sovereignty of the countries in the region. So I will leave it at that, and I look forward to your questions and your comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Helf, for this informative briefing about the U.S. policy in Central Asia. You've raised some of the very important points, I think, and today we are having here the summit of EU and Central Asia heads of states, and they're also discussing many of these issues that you mentioned here. So maybe we just start from this Q&A session. If from the audience you have any questions, please raise your hands. Okay, then maybe I have several questions. Maybe I just start from one. You mentioned the role of China, right? Here. And what is the reading of the Communist Party's Congress just last week, right, in China? And how do you think how China's policy in Central Asia would look like in 5 years, let's say? And what are the consequences of this for the US foreign policy in general and the US foreign policy in Central Asia?
You know, I argue that that China really hasn't seemed to have made the decision of what kind of a role it wants to play in Central Asia. I think probably even more broadly, its relationship to the international system, which is largely tried to take advantage of for its own benefit in the past. I find both the Xi Jinping statement in Astana and, you know, I'm not a China expert, but what I saw of the party Congress, a decision to be more assertive, to take more responsibility for the international system that it would like to see. And there's a difference when you are one of the backbones and founders of an international system from being someone who is peripheral to and maybe just trying to take advantage of the international system. So I would imagine that we will see increased Chinese security commitments in the region in 5 years. If I'm right about, you know, that the tone of that decision and the statement in Astana, you know, we'll see how much they can sustain the level of economic investment. But I think what is important for US policy is, you know, we're not in a position to counteract China in Central Asia. I often, you know, I'll meet with younger students in Central Asia, and they're like, well, why don't you just invest, you know, and soak up what China, you know, why don't you guys just, you know, throw your money in and then China will be, you know, pushed out. I mean, there's no way that we can compete. There's no way American companies are ever going to compete with that level of economic leverage or interest. China, you know, has a very proximate, immediate interest in economic engagement with Central Asia. The United States is very far away from Central Asia, so there's never going to be the same thing. So I think what's incumbent on U.S. policymakers is to really try to figure out where we can be, where Chinese and American and Central Asian interests overlap in ways where we can collaborate. You know, I don't think everything China does is evil. I don't think every investment China makes is exploitative and bad for Central Asia. So how do we find ways to understand where we can collaborate, find out, you know, determine where we can peacefully and properly compete, and then find out where we are going to probably be in conflict with each other, like on Xinjiang and the issue of Uyghurs. And, you know, a mature foreign policy is a foreign policy that can take those three things: confrontation, collaboration, and competition, and do them all, you know, do them all at the same time. You have to be able to do more than one thing in a sophisticated foreign policy relationship. And that's, you know, part of the larger creation of a mature bilateral relationship with China overall.
Okay, thank you very much. We have one question from Camila, and then another question from Ayolum.
Hi, Camila.
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Helf. Very glad to see you.
See you soon.
Yes, very glad to see you soon. Yeah, and also I'm very glad to see my professors from the GSPP after so long time. Yeah, so I'm very grateful for this opportunity to listen to you and also to have a chance to ask questions. So my question would be not necessarily, like not directly about the foreign policy of the US to the Central Asia and towards Kazakhstan in particular. But I would say, since you've mentioned about the self-confidence and engagement position of Central Asian states within, at least in the last few months, it was more or less visible, especially with the change of like Russia's positionality and so on. What I want to ask is about Kazakhstan's international mediation that has been evolving for a while over the last 3 decades. And it's like the future of its international mediation now and the building of this peace broker goodwill image, because it has been going successful so far relatively, and considering the events that are being there right now and CICA summit, in Astana. At the same time, internal domestic tensions, especially such as January events that stirred the country from the inside at the very considerable level over the last, maybe one of the major stirs that became known internationally. To what extent do you think this current internal tensions, like the January aftermath and also the crisis that is coming after Russian mobilization and whatever country is experienced inside, would be some kind of a constraint for Kazakhstani government to continue its goodwill and international mediation in the future? Because so far we know that globally it has been like a wider success. At the same time, considering what has happened in the region in Central Asia lately between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, it was not major intervention either from Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, right, to somehow offer some mediation on that. How would you maybe address all these issues from your perspective?
So you know, I'm old enough to have been, you know, научный сотрудник Академии наук СССР, so I can answer that by saying это диалектика. You know, there's two things going on that can happen, that can coexist at the same time. One of them is, you know, when you look at the 3 presidents who signed the treaty in Cholpan-Ata, when you look at Uzbekistan taking a very unique and aggressive engagement role with the Taliban and trying to find ways to help it evolve through economic engagement. When you look at Kazakhstan taking the lead in you know, as you call it, you know, in the role of trying to become a regional power broker, I think. You know, that's sort of one side of it. The other side of it is, you know, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are in conflict. I think they're in conflict in ways that, you know, we always think the presidents control everything. I think there's conflict going on there that is maybe not completely in control of the presidents. We see also you know, what is to me quite baffling, and you know, I've done a couple of roundtables on this. It's not just the January events in Kazakhstan, but it's also the events in Karakalpakstan with the constitutional reforms and protests there, and with what's been going on in Gorno-Badakhshan. You know, we've seen cases of miscalculation, I would say. You know, the dynamics in all of those cases are much more complex, but the initial conflicts, you know, were based on a miscalculation of internal politics in ways that I think pull in the other direction. So, you know, I can say that, you know, the dialectic is that you've got both of those things, you know, centrifugal and centripetal forces happening at the same time. And, you know, what's I think, you know, what's interesting is, you know, how the governments of the region play those things off, how much that allows other players to come in. Russia's been using, you know, conflicts between countries for a long time to be able to come in and be a broker, right? You know, Putin sits down with Japarov and Rahmon and tries to be a broker. You know, I would see, you know, a very good development of this would be, despite, you know, what internal problems in a place like Kazakhstan, to see Kazakhstan increasingly playing a role of trying to broker issues within the region. that would be, you know, a serious replacement of sort of, you know, everybody has to always go to Putin to get a resolution to everything, right? So, you know, that's, you know, I think the initiative at Cholpanata was a very good start to that. And hopefully, you know, there progress could be made in doing that, because otherwise you're going to wind up with, you know, situations where you've got Turkey and Iran, or, you know, trying to become, you know, military rivals in Central Asia, which I don't think any of us want.
Okay, thank you very much. If I'm not mistaken, we had a question from Ayolum, right?
Yes, you're
Then
right.
Professor Ömer Barış.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes.
do.
Okay. Thank you very much for that lecture about our safety in Central Asia. Dear Professor Gavin Helf, I want to ask you two questions.
Okay.
First, I want to ask about, as you mentioned, about Chinese role in Central Asia. So you said about investments that they did in Kazakhstan, or also, and is it also they want to protect their investments? That's why they, the president of China said about in Astana Forum that they are in their they wanted to say security is more, it's main role to protect Kazakhstan and also their investment. Is it like that? Can you just explain me, just to clarify?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's you know, the declaration in Astana was a very big surprise to all of us, and we took it, you know, very seriously. It was the first time that we'd seen China make a declaration, a security declaration in Central Asia, and it was clearly aimed at Putin. It was clearly aimed at Russia. And if you say we support the independence, territorial integrity, and sovereignty of Kazakhstan, you know, like a month or two after Medvedev, you know, drunk tweets that, you know, don't worry, Kazakhstan will be reabsorbed. You know, it's very clear that, you know, who else threatens Kazakhstan's independence and territorial integrity? You know, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan. So, you know, I think it was the first time that we've seen China take on that kind of a policy commitment and make that kind of an intervention. And then you saw what happened at the summit in Uzbekistan. Where Putin was clearly, you know, I mean, this is one of the interpretations, but it's one that's pretty widespread here, where, you know, Putin is now acting as the junior partner. Right? And China is acting like, you know, the senior partner. Those are very important. You know, that's maybe even more important than the creation of a border patrol base in Badakhshan. You know, that yes, that's important, but this is a policy statement. You know, that you know, we are taking a position on this, and you're going to have to defer to it, and we are no longer going to, you know, simply defer to you, Russia, on issues of security in the region. And we'll see if that's followed by other you know, sorts of policy statements and engagements. I mean, I think they have to figure out, you know, they have to figure out what their relationship with Afghanistan is, and the extent to which, you know, they're willing to take on, you know, security commitments in Afghanistan. You know, they haven't you know, engaged on Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, but, you know, there are things that I think are drawing them in to a security relationship in a reactive manner that you know, are making statements and putting them in a position that is very, very different than what it was before.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Second question, I think you already answered. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Professor Barış?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, we do.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Gavin. And it was very engaging conversation, and thank you for your comments. And I actually have one question by bringing the offensive realist school into perspective, maybe. But by the way, I'm an economics professor, so I'm really an outsider here. You draw a picture between, maybe to borrow the terms from Mersheimer, some great power politics like Russia, China, and the US, and especially for Central Asia and specifically for Kazakhstan. Would that great power politics, or what is happening in Ukraine, or what is happening with respect to Taiwan and China, will create more opportunities in Central Asia or more problems in Central Asia? Something connected to this question is, all of these great powers are not really calm internally. I mean, in China, there is demographic issues. Some people expect an implosion. Russia, Ukraine situation, problematic inside. US with like Trump and Biden, internal politics is still without any problem. So how would that affect the Central Asia? What will be the reflection of this situation from the realist perspective?
So, what I'm arguing is that the great powers who would usually be involved in a great game are very much distracted. And part of that distraction is domestic distraction. There is, I predict that in the next US presidential election, there will be a very strong internationalist and a very strong isolationist choice to be made. But the trend towards US not trying to engage in the outside world, it's going to be about Ukraine. The argument that the US should be involved in places that are so far away is really under debate. So you're right, there's partly internal distraction. And then there's the external distraction, which is that both the US and Russia are now laser focused on Ukraine, right? The most of the bandwidth in the State Department and the administration is focused on Ukraine issues. How can we get Thailand to help us support it, to help us in Ukraine? How can we get Guatemala to help us in Ukraine? So what that does is it creates, I would say it creates both opportunity and threat for all of the countries in the South Caucasus and in Central Asia. And countries are reacting to that in different ways. Armenia and Azerbaijan are creating these, like I said, very strange bedfellow coalitions with countries that otherwise shouldn't necessarily, be working together. But that represents sort of those regional issues, those regional rivalries, those countries that are not global powers, but are regional powers, are starting to move their competition in there. I would throw in, potentially India, although it's got no direct connection, but, who's to say that there wouldn't be some India-Pakistan thing that starts to filter through, right? And some countries are, like I said, I think finding ways to seek their own agency in this context, like I think Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. There are some who are seeking to find support from non-traditional outsiders like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, Armenia and Azerbaijan. And there are some that are just, trying to ignore the problem altogether, like Georgia, which is sort of taken a very strange position. So, I see it both as opportunity and threat. And I think, the disappearance of the big global powers means regional powers are going to be more important in the region. Which also means that the relationship between the countries in the region are going to be more important as well. And I would say, my bottom line is solidarity in the region, agency within the region between the 5 countries of the region is one way to preclude outside powers trying to take advantage of the gaps.
Okay, thank you very much. We just kind of brief comment to what you've said. When it comes to I think again, maybe just my subjective observation. When it comes to foreign big powers, let's say, there is a huge degree of skepticism, I think, in Central Asia. So we are aware of the xenophobic sentiments in the region. The level of anti-Americanism is quite high, and now the war in Ukraine again makes many people to question to what extent we can trust Russia, let's say, when it comes to the kind of bilateral regional cooperation. So yeah, I think that's again, in the region we see this kind of awakening. I mean, if we can say that okay, we need more cooperation inter-regional among 5 states in the region. I think that was a kind of my observation so far. Dina, Professor Dina Sharipova, please, your question.
Yes, hello, Professor Helf.
Hi.
I have 2 questions. Sorry that I don't turn on my camera. I'm a little bit sick, so
Okay.
my question is, how can you evaluate the prospects of democracy promotion efforts of the United States in Central Asia today, and in the future, in the light of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict? We know that this is one of the important instruments of policies of the United States in Central Asia, and we could see that in Russia all these democratic initiatives have been curtailed. So what do you think, what are the prospects for Central Asia? And second question is about your point that you made about the importance to connect Central Asia to global economy. So in your view, what are the ways the United States can help Central Asian states to reconnect to global economy? Is there any specific instruments? Is there any specific US policy? Thank you.
Okay. On democracy promotion, I think, this is an, I guess, I could, if I was giving a talk on great power rivalry and political systems, then that would be a slightly different conversation. But I think, you could probably say, I made the case that the US model of democracy probably hit its height in, January of 1992. It has, in the region, we had Askar Akayev trying to do his best to create, a democratic system in Kyrgyzstan and be open and open to economic investment into the West, and that in the end failed. I think the U.S. model of democracy has been very strongly resisted by Russian propaganda and boiled down to a couple of things that they have good talking points on, which makes it very difficult. But it's not just that. I think, the Russian model of oligarch, oligarch mafia, thuggish economic control is also something that people have rejected in the region. That's, something that has a lot more foothold in the region, but is something that I see very much opposed in the region by, things like the rise of Islamic civil society that tries to find other ways, to organize things. And then third, you have what I think is the Chinese, very different than Russia, a Chinese sort of techno-authoritarian way of organizing things that, down on the level of like, how to organize local politics, CCTV cameras, everything, taken to an extreme. You can take Xinjiang as an example, but there is an attraction in the region to the idea that you can use technology to create better service delivery, better inclusion, better economic growth in ways that don't make you compromise towards American sort of democratic and pluralistic values. So, I guess in answer to that first question, I would say it's, Central Asia, as far as I've seen, has tried to take what it can of, all of those models and apply them in different ways. I look at I've always been impressed with Kazakhstan's ability to take, not take everything whole cloth, but, try to find a way to combine some of these things in ways that lead to better governance and better service delivery, and a more diversified economic system. So I think it's in competition, but I am not right now optimistic that the American model, coming off COVID and coming off our political sort of rivalries of the last decade, looks very attractive, as something that you would want to build right now. On the second question, since we're running low on time, I'll be really brief. I think, in terms of economic reconnectivity, one thing is IT, and that might include an inclusion of some of the Russian IT refugees from the region, renewable energy sources, air travel and connectivity, creating a migration industry. So one of the things that's lacking in the region is, an industry that, instead of just by, casual networking, promotes safe and profitable labor migration to places like the UK, Germany, Eastern Europe, Korea, Japan. And, one I think that's looming is, the diversion of Central Asian labor migrants to the reconstruction of Ukraine once the, Ukrainian Marshall Plan gets put in place. And then, my first job in Kazakhstan back in the 90s was as the IREX regional director. So I will always go back to exchange programs for Central Asia as a way to compete, with the Chinese as well.
Okay, thank you
Okay,
very
thank
much.
you.
Yeah, I think we can take the last question if there are any questions. If no, then I have one final question, just to keep it brief. Yeah, you talked a lot about Turkey and Iran's role, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what do you think about their capability, let's say, to play this bigger role in the region? Because I think we were already in a situation in the 19s when we talked a lot about Iran or Turkey kind of being one of those participants of this big great game, and then later we found out that they didn't have capabilities for this. And again, in this context, can we still talk about them becoming more important players in the region, given that both of them having this domestic political and economic issues?
Yeah, well, that's interesting, isn't it? Those domestic and political, issues often lead to a more aggressive foreign policy. It's a way to displace, some of the internal dissent by finding external enemies and external adventures. So that's something that we've seen, throughout history. I think what's important is that, Turkey and Iran are in competition, largely about, their role as transit countries and energy producing countries, and how they get those things out. Turkey, becomes much more, Turkey is crucial to any middle corridor, Trans-Caspian, energy projects for Central Asia. So its ability, a lot of the weirdness of the coalitions that you see forming around Turkey and Iran have to do with pipelines, have to do with, how oil and gas get out, what route they're going to take. So, in a world where Central Asia is completely surrounded by a bubble of sanctions, with only the Caspian as the egress, suddenly, Turkey becomes important. Iran, though, is there, potentially as another way of egress, if it despite its, sort of, at this point, pariah status in the international system. So, my wife is an energy expert, and so she's got a lot more, thinks a lot more about this. But I think at the basis of that rivalry is a rivalry over, who's going to be a more important player in pipeline politics and energy transit. So, suddenly with that bubble, Iran and Turkey become more important than they were in the 1990s. on these issues.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Helf, for your interesting and very informative talk. And I hope that a lot of us have learned a lot of things from you. And it was interesting to know the DC or American perspective on the things happening in the region. And thank you for this. And thank you for the audience for coming and joining and asking interesting questions. And I hope that we'll see you next time.
All right.
Yes, thank you. Bye-bye.
You're welcome.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.